Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. This is our ongoing series, Life, the Universe, and Humanistic Judaism. This is the eighth in our series, hearing from the rabbis, cantors, and leaders in our movement. It's been quite fascinating to see the variety of interests and topics, and it's been a pleasure. So we are bringing this to you as members of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. You may be a member directly. You may be a member of one of our affiliated communities. If you are a member at one of our affiliate communities, you're also a member at the Society for Humanistic Judaism. So I think we got a few new registrants this time around because folks saw it at the in the newsletter for the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism of Metro Detroit. If you only saw it there and you didn't also get an email from me, make sure that you're on SHJ's email list, because that's how we let you know about upcoming events, how we let you know when there is a new issue of our magazine that comes out, which all members and supporters are entitled to. So we hope you've been finding the programming meaningful, and this is our way of serving you and thanking you for your support in allowing us to bring what we love about humanistic Judaism out into the world and reach more people with it. And that's really been the goal of this series. So today, I am thrilled to welcome Rabbi Jeffrey Falick, who has served as rabbi of the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism of Metro Detroit, formerly the Birmingham Temple, since 2013. Rabbi Falick became involved in secular humanistic Judaism in 2009 after a lifetime of searching and questioning. His involvement in our movement includes his roles on boards and executive committees of the Association of Humanistic Rabbis and the Society for Humanistic Judaism. Rabbi Falick received his BA from the University of Texas at Austin and his MA and ordination from the Reform Movement's Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, Ohio. He previously served as director of Hillel Jewish Student Centers at universities in Illinois and Miami, and at the Jewish Community Center in Miami. As a Jewish educator, Rabbi Falick has served as a faculty member at numerous schools and programs, including the Melton School and several congregations and community-wide youth programs. He is taught in the FedEd program of the Detroit Federation and is a popular speaker on subjects like Who Wrote the Bible and the Evolution of God. Rabbi Falick is also very active in the secular humanistic world and was recognized for his intra-humanistic organizational efforts with the 2018 Freethinker of the Year Award by the Center for Inquiry in Michigan. So let me put a spotlight on you as well. And, okay, I did this wrong. Hang on. Spotlight on me. And welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. You had asked me to kick you off on the big, broad topic of enlightenment. So as a linear thinker, my first question on enlightenment is, when did it start? What is it? Tell us about it just in the general world, even before we get to the impact that it had on the Jews.
Sure.
What was going on before it? What caused it? Why is it called enlightenment? Give us the big broad overview.
So I don't know if maybe I'm just weird. Maybe everybody has a favorite century, but I actually do. I have a favorite century. It's the 17th century. You can get me going on the 17th century anytime. And so when you asked me about this, I thought, well, I got to do a little bit on that. And that's really where the Enlightenment began. So just for those of us who need a little refresher, Paul sent me a series of questions this morning, and I realized, oh, I'm going to be actually teaching a little bit of the Enlightenment, so I better go and grab some notes. But I think that these are things most of us are generally aware of. The whole thing kicked off, well, a lot of people say it kicked off with the scientific revolution. I actually think it kicked off with the Renaissance and what we call Renaissance humanism. This is a European-wide effort that really traveled to Europe from the Arab nations that had translated so many of the classics. And they basically re-engaged with Greek thought, Greek and Roman thought to a certain extent, which was largely repetitious of Greek thought. And that sort of set off an appreciation of what humans with their own brains could do. It, in a way, released Europe from many of the problems that Christianity had imposed upon it. And this wasn't an anti-Christian thing at all. It wasn't anti-religious. In fact, it was quite pious in many ways, but it did pose enormous problems, especially as it moved from Renaissance humanism into actual scientific exploration. And I like to tell the kids in our Spinoza program and their parents, it's a family program, that if you really want to look at the guy who changed the whole world, in a way, it was a tie between Galileo Galilei and Isaac Newton, both of whom are more or less 17th century guys. One died the same year the other was born. That would be Galileo. And we know what they were doing. They were taking tools of the brain and tools of observation, and they were, in many cases, diverting or diverging from the mythological explanations of how the universe worked. And this is like, what did somebody send me a joking thing earlier? It's like a video game, human knowledge level achieved. And so we stepped up a little bit. And really, we stepped up a lot because it had such a profound effect on everything in Europe. It had already had a profound effect on the Arab world, but they were already along the way because of what had happened with the Reconquista. They were sort of on the receding end of things historically. But now, as Europe begins to acknowledge it, particularly, but not only Central and Western Europe, we begin to meet people who you probably remember studying in school, and I'll just mention their names. People like Descartes. I think, therefore I am. This fellow who lived at the very end of the 16th, born in the very end of the 16th century. He brought in this hyper rationalistic, skeptical kind of way of looking at the world. Everything had to be examined. Everything had to be from its deepest, most rooted source, had to be understood and questioned. And that was the only way you were going to get to anything. At the same time as all of this is happening, people of great note are gathered, glomming onto that. There's political changes taking place in the world. Most notably, and one that people tend to forget about, but I think it's actually the most important, is what was happening in England. And it was the most important because of what happened here as a result. England produced some of the greatest political philosophers. And not only did they produce the greatest political philosophers, but they spent nearly a century fighting over what kind of country they wanted to have. And they started with an absolute monarchy at the beginning, and they ended with a quasi-democracy at the end. Any of you, one of my obsessions is to study what was called the Glorious Revolution. This is my favorite revolution. It was that great that I think its glorious attribute counts. And it was just basically when the British said, we're not doing this anymore. One king out, bring a new king in. The guy wasn't even British. This is William and Mary, right? Mary was the actual heir. Actually, her uncle was. They threw him out. Now, a lot of it had to do with differences over Catholicism and Protestantism, but they were really political differences. They were never as much religious differences. And so this great time of political and economic change is also demonstrably strong in the Netherlands. All of these places are going to have an effect on where on the where we're sitting right now. And at this time, too, all these great major figures begin to appear. I like to say, and it's a little bit tribalistic, but I actually think it's true, that Spinoza, Benedict Baruch Spinoza, is really the one of the most important political philosophers. We tend to, as Jews, focus upon his whatever theology he had, and Jews will argue about it, but I think it's arguing over mist, because we don't really know or care, or we shouldn't care. He didn't believe in the God of Moses and Israel and of the Bible, so that's going to have a big effect later on us, as humanistic Jews, but his published and known work in his lifetime was the political treatise that he wrote. And anybody can read that. Forget about his other work. Unless you know something about Euclidean geometry, which I don't really even actually know what that means, you're going to really need somebody like sitting and holding your hand to understand the other one that was published posthumously. But this thing, it's practically it's a combination between the best introduction to the critical study of the Bible and religion, and the first ever written, calling upon names of people, particularly Avram ibn Ezra, who lived before him, who hinted at the fact that maybe the Bible wasn't the word of God, or wasn't the word of God the way it had been purported to be, that there was a human hand there, that there were contradictions and all kinds of things. I mean, he couldn't know everything that we know now, but he knew a lot. And at the same time, a lot of Thomas Jefferson is in there too, in the way that he imagines a future government. As I mentioned, in England, we had so much social and political uh, uh, philosophy going on, but John Locke, notably, there were others as well. In France, which was a big hotbed of all of this, Denis Diderot this is already into the 18th century, was working on his encyclopedia of everything. So this is what we mean by the Enlightenment. It's this incredible moment in time, goes for about 200 years, that ultimately leads to two major political revolutions. And one of them is here in the United States, and the other one is in France. The one in the United States is a work in progress, but basically is held. The one in France, kind of, but they tried and tried and tried again and tried again, and ultimately they seem to have put something together. So that's that. So that's the Enlightenment on the head of a pen.
Spinoza was before that, right? He really.
Well, he's early 17th century. He's in communication with Descartes for one,
Right.
but
Okay.
he's living 16 his years. He died very young,
Right.
probably because he was pushed out of the Jewish community. He had to become a lens grinder, and they didn't wear masks, so he got a whole bunch of glass in his lungs. But he was from 1632 to 1677, so
Okay.
he's in the thick of things here.
Okay. Great.
We're in the
And
same we're in the same year as Locke.
okay. And what was the situation of the Jews at that time?
Okay, so while the Enlightenment is going to have an enormous impact on Jewry, it doesn't really have that much of an impact right away, because the Jews don't live where the Enlightenment is happening. The Enlightenment is, with the exception of Eastern of Germany, which is sort of the area where all the crossover is, right, between Eastern Europe and Central and Western Europe. So the Jews are not really involved quite so much yet. The numbers of Jews living, and I'm terrible at numbers, so I'm not going to give you numbers, but it's very small, the number of Jews living in Central and Western Europe compared to those living in Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europe is not famous for its Enlightenment. Now, we know that they had various periods in time and various czars and so forth that would work on it here and there. That's a whole very, very long story. But by and large, at the same time that a lot of this is happening, so is the disappearance of the Polish-Lithuanian nationhood, and Russia is taking more and more hold of the areas where Jews live, and there's millions of them there, and there are not millions of Jews living in Central or Western Europe. But that doesn't mean that the influence didn't eventually get there. It gets there in a number of ways. Number one, there are Jews living in Central Europe and in France and in England and other places, the Netherlands. And these people have more or less, they're the remnants, or maybe the descendants or the remnants who stayed, but the Jews there never had a good showing. They were being expelled as early as the 12th, 13th, 14th century, leaving of their own accord, heavily in the 15th century, before and after that. that's how we believe that the Eastern European population of Yiddish-speaking Jews began. But they were there, and they were living under the old feudal system, where they were essentially there at the pleasure of the king. And in a place like Germany, we're talking about hundreds of little duchies and little city states and all kinds of levels of rule and government. Too many to keep track of from my brain, but ultimately they began to view this whole thing, this idea which came along with separation of church and state, as I mentioned, and secularism, as an opportunity to become part of the polity of the country. And there was a lot of distrust. Voltaire, for instance, said everything to the Jew, nothing to the Jewish people, nothing to the nation. There was a lot of distrust in them as a group. Anti-Semitism did not magically disappear, but the idea that Jews could be citizens and have rights, that began to grow. It began to grow notably in England. It took a while. It began to grow notably in France. That took a while. And in fact, Napoleon kind of halfway believed it, kind of didn't halfway believe it. He had convened to call Napoleon an enlightener is to give him a lot of credit that he doesn't deserve. But I think he saw himself that way. And not a democratic enlightener, but enlightener nonetheless. He convened a Sanhedrin of Jewish notables and asked them all these questions that are critical questions to study in Jewish history about what is the role of the Jew in a country, or do you consider yourselves, this is the most important question, do you now, having been offered these rights and privileges of citizenship, do you now consider yourselves citizens? Are you Frenchmen? Or are you Jews? Because this idea of whether we're a nation or a religion or what have you, and this begins all these questions. In Eastern Europe, it begins to seep over, sort of, and a movement of Yiddish-speaking enlighteners begin a sort of a parallel movement called the HCAL. But it's not the same. It's not the same. It's not the Voltairean Enlightenment in Yiddish. It's got its own issues. It wants to decide how can you secularize Judaism, but really secularize it. In Middle Europe, they're talking about how can we reform Judaism? How can we change Judaism? And there we see a particularly well-known character, and now this is the 18th century, Moses Mendelssohn emerges, and he's the grandfather of the famous composer. And Moses Mendelssohn, who's in Germany, which is, and Prussia in particular, is a hotbed of emancipation, though they're not necessarily open to bringing new Jews in. You still need to be, to get in the right way. One of those immigration battles that we've never heard of course, in our country. But Moses Mendelssohn, he is, I would say, the first real sort of practical thinker about how we can balance this Enlightenment thing with Jewish religion. He's an Orthodox Jew. He gets accused all the time by the Orthodox of being the first Reform Jew, but his reforms were so minuscule that they're almost laughable. Translate the Bible so people can understand it in German, or put it in German letters so they can at least read it. Really, so little. He had some friends in the Enlightenment there, in that little movement, and he was a little bit influential, but his goal was to sort of keep Jews Jewish. And that became the way that the Enlightenment played out all throughout Central Europe, primarily Germany. But again,
that's interesting. So the HCAL is overlapping or in response to Enlightenment?
It's overlapping and in response, and it's happening in a place where there's very little Enlightenment, because it's mostly
when you say
European phenomenon.
Right. When you say keep them Jewish, though, was it also in a response to
so I have to
secularizing?
Say, I'm not sure Moses Mendelssohn can be considered a man of the HCAL. I think he's a man of the Jewish Reformation, and I do put those in different categories, because the HCAL is also heavily influenced by all of the political things that are happening in Russia and Poland and all that area. Because they're going in different directions over there, whereas things are evolving much more peacefully in Central Europe. And when a revolution pops up, and in 1848 there were a whole bunch of them, they all popped up at once. They get put down, and there's other movements that are growing there. The Romanticism movement, which has an effect on creating nationalism. So the Jews are dealing there in a very different environment than they are with what's going on in the revolutionary side. And this is get from the 18th century now into the 19th and even early 20th century. So the Jews over there are trying to essentially figure out how can we be who we are, and where do we belong on the religious, on the political, on the secular. And so they're eventually going to be the ones who start thinking about Zionism, leaving, or Bundism, nationalism but staying, and all kinds of communisms and all kinds of socialisms. And ultimately, none of this is going to matter very much because nothing successful emerges from there. It all emerges from the place where people are freer to have these conversations. In Central Europe, it's not looked upon kindly to be a secular person. There's really no option to be a secular person, and the Jews living there are doing much better. They're doing much better. There's fewer of them to begin with, and when they're not doing well, they decide to leave, and mostly for economic reasons. The 1848 revolutions lead to a small but significant exodus of Jews to the United States. And here, they're not working on becoming great communist, socialist, Marxists, or whatever the hell's going on over there in Eastern Europe. They're not developing Yiddish as a sophisticated language. They can't stand Yiddish. They call it jargon. They think it's just, the worst thing ever that this happened to their beautiful German. No, they're going to America for economic opportunities, and they come over here in a few 100,000. And the reason the Enlightenment becomes so important to the Jews is because there's Jews in America. That's really my theory of it, is that there's Jews in America because the Jews in Europe, in Eastern Europe, are going to do so horribly badly over the next 40 to 50 years, where their life and limb is constantly endangered. And we know what happened with the pogroms and so forth that pick up heavily in the 1880s. And it's exactly at that moment that they begin to arrive in the United States. Plus, they're dirt poor. Plus, they've been oppressed in the Pale of Settlement. Plus. It's repressive, and there's so many of them. Whereas over here, something else is happening.
So I'm trying to get from then to where we are now with Jewish denominationalism and so
and
on.
That's why I'm dealing with that. So this is where it starts. So in Germany, what are the Jews beginning to do? In the 1830s and 40s, small clusters, tiny clusters of Jews are thinking about reformatting or reforming Judaism. They think, well, if we can make it a little bit more palatable, it's not so easy. In some places, it was going along okay. But in other places, you had to compete with the traditional Jews. There were still plenty of traditional Jews in Central Europe.
Was there always a mix of observances even before Enlightenment?
There was. This is something historians argue about. To what extent were people actually observant and where? And it's very difficult to know because it's sort of like studying household religion in ancient Israel. These were not things that were commented upon. We do know that where Jews were, there were frequently enforcement mechanisms to make them behave. And those enforcement mechanisms were available to them even in Central Europe, depending on where they were in Germany, for instance, very heavily so. Even during the golden age of Jewry in Poland, there were rules that you had to go to synagogue, you had to do this, you had to do that, and they enforced them. So we don't really know that. We do know that the minute that the Enlightenment starts in Europe, they begin to consider just leaving. Now, you couldn't just leave. There wasn't yet a secular Jew, but you could convert, and you could convert insincerely and be an insincere Lutheran or an insincere Catholic, like all the other insincere Lutherans and Catholics, and basically just sort of drift out of it. Or you could just do whatever you wanted and be Jewish, but not really pay attention to it too much. But these fellas, particularly the heirs of Mendelssohn, this group of people, these reformers, they felt that if they could simply make you a man of or a woman of the Jewish religion, then number one, they will have solved the nationalism versus religion issue. Identity would have been solved once and for all. And number two, we would give you a religion that was a Judaism for the modern age. And that's what they started to work on. And these were the reformers, and they created Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism was not a movement. You couldn't go to a Reform rabbinical school. These were little groups of rabbis holding synods here, there, and everywhere. Um, and this somebody's asking, is this where culture versus religion? This is really more. They weren't looking at themselves to be part of a Jewish culture. That was an Eastern thing that was going on, and that'll come to America too. But what they were working on was trying to make Judaism a respectable religion. And they worked first of all, they wanted it to be a modern religion, a sort of a Kantian religion. They wanted to get rid of all of the unnecessary rituals that were driving a wedge between them and their fellow Germans and fellow Frenchmen and so forth. The fact that they couldn't eat together. I mean, right away there you have, I mean, this enormous, the fact that you're supposed to bring disputes to a rabbinical court and so forth, even though the law, if it was between you and a Gentile, but what about two Jews who just wanted to be two Jewish Germans? So they begin to have little parlor meetings here, there, and everywhere. It was hard to open synagogues, although they were successful at doing it, because sometimes the government had a recognized Lutheran, a recognized Catholic, and a recognized Jewish group. This is how it worked in most of Central Europe. You paid a tax to the government. The government distributed it to these groups. And so they had a say in who got to be the rabbi. And I think they liked the people who were the most peaceful, and maybe gave them a kickback, although I don't have evidence of that. But it tended to be traditional people. In any case, after 1848, a lot of these people, the slowness of the reform that's taking place, the number of compromises they have to make, just the overall kind of yuckiness of living under some of these revived monarchies and this romanticism that's a little bit even begins to smell like what Nazism will smell like in its early stages. They leave and they come to America. And they come to an America that is had no significant Jewish population for a very long time. There's really been no Jews here for a while. There are the descendants of some Jews. There's a pocket here and there, but most of the Sephardic Jews who lived here during the Revolution have long assimilated out of existence here. And so there's very, very little, very few congregations exist. There are some, but I don't think there's a rabbi here until the early 1820s, 30s. I have to look that up. But there are synagogues that have been in constant use, but we know what they are. You can put them on, you can count them on a hand, maybe two. So, but they get here and they discover what America does, which is congregational religion, which is to say, you want a religion, start a congregation. That's it. That's the entire requirement. That's how Scientology gets to be a religion. That's how the Satanists, the Satanic Temple, the good ones are humanists. That's how they get to be a religion. That's all you have to do is open up your doors. And they just go wild here, and they start fighting with each other, and they establish seminaries hither and yon. The conservatives among them start their own little branch. That's why they're called conservative Jews.
Well, tell the Trafe banquet story. I don't know if everyone knows.
Oh, there are a couple, and one notably, who are trying to unify everyone. They think that in America they can create one. They don't call it a denomination, but one way of being Jewish for everyone. And one of these dreamers is a man named Isaac Mayer Wise. Isaac Mayer Wise lives in the mid to late 1800s in Cincinnati, Ohio. He doesn't start out there. He comes over from Bohemia. He makes his way to Albany, I believe. He gets into a fist fight with a rabbi there. He winds up leaving. He goes to Cincinnati. Cincinnati's the Queen City. It's the gateway to the West. Don't tell anybody there it's St. Louis. It's not. Chicago barely exists, and it's the great city of German culture. And this is where the German culturated Jews want to be. Here and in New York, of course, is a very big group. But he says, why don't we try to unite everybody? He talks to an Orthodox rabbi in Philadelphia. They try to put something together, although that guy quickly figures out that what Wise wants is also going to be tied in to the religious reforms that that he's not so interested in. That none of the traditional Jews here are, and there are a handful. They come over too from Germany, but you got to remember that if you're going to leave Germany as an Orthodox, or what they would have called then a traditional Jew, and come here, you're already going to be one of those kind of adventurous traditional Jews, right? You're not going to be you're not going to be the heavily Yiddish type. If you remember the movie with Gene Wilder,
Frisco Kid.
the Frisco Kid. He's coming over from Poland, but the congregation he goes to serve in San Francisco, where some of these German Jews go to, they're traditional, but you can tell right away they're not really what the people back in Poland when they sent away for the rabbi in the mail were like. They're already Americanized to a great degree. So there are splits, and one of the great splits is between the conservative reformers and the more radical reformers. Now they've been trying, and you can hear it in the language. Isaac Mayer Wise, in the language that he uses to try to put together this umbrella movement of Jews in America. He writes a prayer book called Minhag America. You can see a copy of it in the Smithsonian. So that's one thing, the custom of America. And he makes it even a little more traditional than his family members who are more radical reformers and so forth want, and his opponents. He says, we're going to have a union of all the American congregations. Germans like to call Jews two different things, sometimes Israelites and sometimes Hebrews. These were words that the average Gentile in America liked better than Jude, Jew. That one didn't sound Yid. A Hebrew, now that's a man, right? An Israelite, that's a biblical man. So you wind up with two great journals, the American Israelite, which is still in production. It's the local Jewish newspaper of Cincinnati today, but it was once a very important journal, and so forth. But he decides his group is going to be called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the UAHC. And hopefully most of us know that was the name of the Reform movement until it just became so ridiculous to keep it anymore that they finally decided to change it. And they start a rabbinical school, a rabbinical college in Cincinnati in the 1870s that's going to be this Hebrew Union's college. And lo and behold, it is the Hebrew Union College. Now, there is no longer a Union of American Hebrew Congregations. There's no longer a Hebrew Union of any kind. But this was meant to bring everyone together. And that meant to the more conservative scholars and so forth. So everybody comes to Cincinnati and starts up this school. It's a big venture. You've got a connection to the university and everything. And very quickly, it's obvious they cannot live together, because one group is, hungry for the bacon, and the other one, they're just willing to talk about some minor prayer book reforms. And one group is bashing the Talmud, and the other one is consulting it, and it just doesn't work out. By the time of their very first ordination, it's clear they're going to separate. But the separation is made almost inevitable, well, completely inevitable, by the symbolic bullshit that the radical reformers do by putting clams on the half shell on the menu of the first ordination banquet, and it came to be famously known as the Treifa banquet. Until sadly, the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati is closing. And we don't know what's going to happen to the campus there. They're still doing fine. They have a Cincinnati campus, a New York campus, a Los Angeles campus, a Jerusalem campus, but Cincinnati just couldn't hold it, which I loved living there and studying. It was a real campus with like 5 or 6 buildings. And when we were ordained, the custom was we would put out at our kosher lunch, because we had so many traditional family members by now who were coming to our ordination lunch, we would put out a Xerox of the Treifa banquet menu on everybody's plate. We kept that tradition alive. I guess it's gone now. Ultimately, those guys left. They went to where it was happier for them anyway, which was New York. They started their own theological seminary, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, JTSA. It was a complete and total bust. It lost money hand over fist, and it was about to go out of business when they got a bright idea to reorganize it. And here the Eastern Europeans come back into play. Remember all those Eastern Europeans we had sitting back there? Well, within about 5-6 years, they're all coming here. And not in the hundreds of thousands, but in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And they are extremely problematic for the German Jews who are here, who did not come over here by and large poor, who came over here and settled everywhere. Even in my, I'm 62 years old, and I can remember driving through the South, the Midwest. I served a congregation in Portsmouth, Ohio, little tiny town, on the train to Cincinnati, and so did many other rabbis serve these little places. Well, these people, they were basically going to the big cities, New York, Philadelphia, eventually Chicago, a few other places. And they were schmutzy, and they were poor, and they were problematic in every way, and they were not Americanized, and a lot of them were politically problematic too. And how are you going to get these people to start talking and being like Americans? Well, first of all, they're not joining your temple, and it's a temple without yarmulkes. They're not joining that. So, but do you really want them all learning in Stiebels, or worse, going to Emma Goldman lectures? I mean, the two options are horrifying. A group of wealthy American Reform Jews, primarily from the Upper East Side, they get an offer, they get a request. And this is one of my favorite stories in all of American Jewish history, from the people that are watching the Jewish Theological Seminary circle the drain, these Germans, and they say, we're going to bring over a scholar from England. That's going to be Solomon Schechter. It takes a while. He doesn't come right away, but we need some money. We're going to try to reorganize. And these German Jews, they put a lot of money into it, not because they have any interest in being conservative Jews. And by the way, in those days, conservative meant basically modern Orthodox. It wasn't that different. The things even that modern Orthodox and conservative Jews eventually argued about, many of them hadn't been invented yet. There wasn't electricity. It was not a big issue on Shabbat. Nobody had cars. Nobody was watching TV or anything like that. Or no malls to go to. So they were basically Orthodox, but they were Orthodox with a much more Americanized thing. Because one of the things all the reformers agreed on was that you don't go to shul and all the children running around and look like a Chabad. Everybody loves that now. But American Jews back then, these German Jews, whether they were the conservative ones or the reform ones, they did not love that. What they wanted was decorum, a nice choir. And by the way, this is still a format of some Orthodox congregations. The great synagogue of Jerusalem still does this. I mean, it's a men's choir, but the men were all in charge anyway. The mixed seating, that doesn't even come in Reform until much later than you think. We don't talk about women rabbis, homosexuality. None of that even exists. So they fund this. Why do they fund it? Because they're very American. The conservative synagogues that have been opening up are really American. They speak English. They're not socialists. The children go to college. And now we've got a whole giant stew of Yiddish Jews that we can Americanize with this. And that was the whole point of it. And it worked because the conservative movement became the largest denomination. Meanwhile, Reform Judaism became more and more, well, less and less ritualistic, more and more, in some ways, humanistic, but there was still a piety about it. There was still a lot of piety about it. But God was more and more relegated to sort of the object, the Kantian the moral imperative. That's what God is, the moral imperative of the Kantians. And it's going to take a while before Reform Judaism becomes what it is today, which is indiscernible from conservative Judaism, because the two movements are the same exact movement today.
And yeah, I think that could be a whole other conversation about how the rise and fall of those denominations, like in the 80s, the way Reform embraced, well, not embraced necessarily, but at least accepted intermarriage. Whereas,
yeah. And the intermarriage took longer, but because the ceremonial stuff, that's where everybody liked. They liked Shabbat. They liked holidays. This was also the years, the 60s, 70s, 80s, the years of identity movements.
Right.
So that was a big part of it.
Right.
So, humanistic Judaism is not going to jump off of this until the 1950s. And that's only in the brain of Sherwin Wine. So,
So I want to leave time for some Q&A because people
sure.
are writing in the comments and
Okay.
it seems like there are questions, but just to bring it back to Enlightenment. So obviously, I think we all know that America became like the golden dream for, certainly Eastern European, but European Jewry in the 20th century. And we also know that America, perhaps more than any other country, tried to live out the ideals of the Enlightenment in, separation of church and state and the Constitution. What were those ideals, just in a nutshell, that you think were so influential in making America the place where Jews could actually come to, and for the most part, thrive without the kind of anti-Semitism that they experienced in Europe?
Well, now there's going to be a lot of anti-Semitism in America, but it's going to be social anti-Semitism. Most of the de jure anti-Semitism begins to dry up very quickly, and not because of the Jews, but because of the internecine fighting between all kinds of Christians, who ultimately, inspired by the United States Constitution and the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, which are now very much in war with each other, unfortunately. The various states that still have impediments to that also cause problems for Jews and anybody else, those began to dry up, and the United States Constitution right away doesn't put up with it. And so this becomes a place where Jews realize they are going to be like other people. And so what is going to distinguish them as Jews? Well, Jews, and the reason that we still, by and large, support progressive causes, it has to do with the freedom of religion that's given to us. The fact that the Jews could jump off their ships in the 1850s and go about their business. I mean, how many hundreds and probably hundreds and hundreds of synagogues, temples, they were calling them, just to be more American, were forming then. This essential secularism of the country. The tolerance had already been expressed, and this becomes iconic in the words of the president, the first president. We're not going to tolerate persecution and intolerance. We're not going to. Everybody gets to sit under their own. I'm trying to quote it, and of course I can't remember the exact quote.
To tolerance, no, yeah, I know the quote.
Yeah, sometimes I know it by heart, but
it was in a letter from George Washington as president to the congregation in
yes,
Rhode
in
Island.
the Toro synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, and actually they kind of fed him the lines, by the way.
Bigotry, no sanction. Thank you, Elise.
Right, to bigotry, no sanction. This was inspiring, the first president telling you this, and America got a reputation overseas. America was a nothing. I mean, it's a little tiny nothing country, but here it was growing and growing, and it was growing on the basis of these values. And they by and large did not think of coming anywhere else when they were disillusioned. They certainly weren't going to go east. Israel was not even a thing in their brains. The early Reform Jews were not Zionists. They were not Zionists in the sense that they thought the whole thing was just ridiculous. If you want, Washington was their Jerusalem. If you really wanted to be free, go to America. And the country was just a magnet for that. There was nowhere else on earth where you could go, not a single other place on the planet, where you could go and just be Jewish any way that you want to do, and just do it, and have anything you want to do. Now there were, as it turns out, limits that developed, but they were the limits that applied to everyone. It turned out not to be so great if you were a communist. If you were, Emma Goldman didn't stay, did she? But by and large, people who just wanted a slice of this American dream, they found a way to get it. And the capitalism didn't hurt because it was entrepreneurial. There were a lot of barriers to being a free Jew, a free person in this country. My grandparents' generation, my great grandparents' generation for sure, they didn't have freedom to join whatever law firm if they were lucky enough to get into a college. It was very difficult to find places to express your to learn, and so we had Jewish colleges and Jewish law firms and Jewish hospitals, and this and that was Jewish. But lots of people were doing that ethnically anyway, and the Jews weren't the only group that had problems. Every group that came here had problems, and the blacks had the worst problems of all. And their problems were, way more than just skin deep. Yeah, we continue to struggle with anti-Semitism, and it goes up and down, and we're seeing a resurgence now, and we'll leave that for a different topic. But the basic values of free expression in this country and just freedom of movement and freedom of everything that they did not have back home. They were still begging, in the mid 1800s for representation and the right to run for office in England. We're here, we had, and we had them on both sides. We had Jews in the Confederacy too.
I know, but that the ideals that they, are the founders of our country put down on paper, even as they were like, hand me my pen, slave, while I write out all men are created equal, right? But they had the ideals, and they knew they weren't living up to it yet. But they put it down because the idea was we would get there. And I do think it is really interesting to kind of trace the way that the Jews in America, are part of that rise to greater equality, and it in our time, it feels like rights are being set back. It felt like we were on this march, right? And now there's a reactionary wave. But overall, the history is more and more right.
I think it's always two steps forward and one step back in America. And the founders, they wanted what they wanted for themselves. They didn't really give a whole lot of regard to other people. Everybody wants what they want for themselves. And then, if they get enlightened enough, they join a movement, and their grandkids maybe will help bring the next thing about. So I don't love the founders for not doing it for everyone, but I also don't fault them for not living in the 21st century because they didn't get that.
I think a couple of them had it in mind that it would be for everyone eventually, not right now.
Thomas Jefferson said it, hey, they ain't ready. We ain't ready. This world's not ready. But we know what that's like because we're in a world that's not ready for a lot of things, maybe to our peril, some that might be far more dangerous in terms of the success of our planet.
Yeah. If folks have questions that they want to ask and can raise their hand virtually using Zoom, which I don't even know where that is. I'm sorry.
There's a big chat thing here. So a lot of them are just comments on stuff. What's the causal relationship between Enlightenment and migration to the U.S.? It depends on where we're talking, what immigration we're talking about. There were two, as I mentioned earlier, there were two major immigrations. There was there was a first one, but that was tiny. We call it the first great one, but 25 people in a boat from Recife, Brazil is not exactly world shattering. It was for us, but not for the rest of the world. But there was the post revolutionary mid 19th century that had a lot to do with the Enlightenment because the emancipation was holding out so much. But it was also a slow process, and the Jews wanted it to go faster, and they wanted more freedom to come with it. And that's why they wound up coming here, those German Jews. And they didn't come in there in the millions. They came in the few hundred thousands, if even that. I can't remember the number. But the next wave, I guess the Enlightenment connection is much more distant. It's that the Enlightenment is a very big reason this country exists. And this country was the only place they could imagine going. You've seen Fiddler on the Roof, Yenta, the silliest, also very smart, but the silliest and least serious character in the entire show winds up trying to go to Israel. And no one ever knows what happens to her. She just disappears off the face of the earth. We can imagine exactly what happened to Tevye and his children. I remember I once did a whole camp curriculum in the 1980s and 90s around this, where we would teach kids this is a reform summer camp, teaching them Jewish rituals by way of Fiddler on the Roof and what they were doing. and then teaching them about Jewish history by way of making up stuff that we thought Tevye was doing. And because this was in Texas, this particular camp, we managed to get Tevye's children and grandchildren to Dallas and Houston, which was not so unreasonable because we all got there. But that's a very tenuous connection. It's the most important, but it's also the most tenuous because it didn't come from Jews back east looking at Americans saying, "Oh, Voltaire had it right." That wasn't what was happening. It was the Golden Medina. They had all kinds of imagination about it.
Anyone want to unmute and ask a question? Or here's another one. Was the U.S.
Mary's waving her hand around.
I'd like to. So for me, when I think about the Enlightenment, the big picture thought that I have is that there was a transition from the rabbis controlling Judaism to lay people making decisions about Judaism.
So I think it's, yes, the emancipation for sure begins to provide that for the Jews in Central Europe. The Eastern Europe is a whole different story. But the rabbis there, they don't want to be those kind of rabbis anyway. They want to be German clerics. They want to be Anglican priests. But they still kind of want to be, the ones telling you how to do Jewish. It's just that the kind of Jewish they want you to do is more, they want it to be more up your alley. So I don't think it's a direct relationship. I think it's a swirling around of things meeting each other.
So one of the things that happened in the United States is that non-rabbis, so Jewish people came. And when they started forming communities, then they decided, oh, we need a rabbi.
Correct.
So they hired a rabbi.
Yes.
So in that way,
yes,
they were deciding what kind of rabbi they wanted, what they wanted the rabbi to do. And as you mentioned, rabbis wanting to be more, let's say, Protestant-like.
They want to be clerics.
Right. And that happened here too. So as the Jewish communities were bringing in a rabbi, they're looking around at everybody else going, oh, we want a clerical rabbi. We don't want a rabbi that's going to do Jewish law and tell us what.
Depending on where you were, because that phenomenon was also happening in the more conservative groups. It was also happening in the Orthodox groups. So you were still getting hired, and you still are. But there is this principle in halacha that once you picked your rabbi, you're supposed to listen to them. Now, I can tell you from the personal experience of witnessing certain family members of mine that they don't do that quite as much. But back then, I think they kind of did, and I still know plenty of Orthodox Jews who kind of do. So that's why I say a swirling around. It's a dance, how much are we hiring you because we want to hear the pretty things you say and how to be Jewish from you and this and that. But the more you walked along the left, the more you really were seeing that they were looking to the rabbis for how to be Jewish the way they wanted to be Jewish. And the rabbis were in agreement with them.
Which is why my big picture is there was a transition from the rabbi was totally in charge to lay people are very much in charge.
Well, the rabbis, they didn't lead the mid-19th century immigration here. The lay people came over, and the rabbis, these radical rabbis, they were like, oh, we could get jobs there and stuff. That's the kind of community we want to lead. I mean, there were a handful of them, and there were thousands of the lay people. And you're exactly right. They, by and large, they came here and they had to compete for their jobs, and it's been so ever since.
Well, and eventually we get into the 70s where we have the Chavurah movement, where there is no rabbi.
Do it yourself, but it didn't quite pan out that well either.
True.
But that had more to do with the need for infrastructure, I think, not so much the need for rabbis.
Right, but I still see it as a progression from Enlightenment.
Oh, yeah.
It was not going to occur before Enlightenment.
Everything in American Judaism is 1000% related to the secular, non-controlling government. Whatever you want to say about this government and how much it's imposing religious values, it's not telling you how to daven or what to eat. You know, the things that they're caught up in are things that are basically liberal versus conservative culture war stuff. By and large, the things that we're doing as Jews, every Jewish decision I make, there's nobody who cares. I mean, I was a rabbi at a JCC, and I proclaimed my atheism, and I couldn't get it. And there was one guy who lost it on me because he thought, you know, it was his Rabbi, and he was in a lot of classes of mine. They could not have given less shits about me being a proclaimed atheist. I opened a blog called The Atheist Rabbi in 2009. Nobody cared. They were used to this already. In America, just do your Jewish how you want. Nobody cared.
I think you were in a unique community when Rabbi Wolpe, David Wolpe, let it slip that the Exodus might not have happened. His conservative community kind of got really upset at him, and he walked it back.
Well, he was serving a non-pluralistic group. He was serving a group that believed that he was teaching something, and then he said something else. Where I was teaching, you know, if you were at a JCC, you didn't get hired for that.
Yeah.
So even though you did some Jewish education, and there's rabbis who do serve JCCs, you weren't there for your theological beliefs. So be whatever kind of Jew you want to. This speaks more to what Mary was talking about. People picking their rabbis. They picked this guy to do something, and then he did something else.
Right. Fascinating. Well, I really appreciate this. It's been, I feel like we just scratched the surface, and that there can be so much more and different tangents that we can learn about and discuss. So thank you so much for your time. Thanks everybody for being here. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, have a great day all. Take care.